Hello everyone and welcome to the next video in the vocal analysis series. We are going to be talking about June today, and once again I apologize for how long this video took, but September is always kind of a busy month for me, so that's really the only excuse I have. But when it comes to June, the comment I see the most often about his voice is that people feel there's a pretty big disconnect between his speaking and singing voices. And I spent a lot of time while I was putting the vocal parts of this video together trying to figure out why that is. For me, at least, it always feels like I never expect June's singing voice to sound like it does, even after 8 years of him being in the game, and I think I might at least have a theory as to why that is. And if you guessed it's a larynx thing, you'd be right. Yuma just happens to have a very big difference between what his voice while singing with a raised larynx sounds like and what his voice when it's neutral or lowered sounds like. And while the latter two are much closer to the speaking voice he uses for June, when it comes to singing he tends to stay quite a bit higher, both to match with Hiyori in Eve's songs and to create a contrast with Nagisa and Ibara in full Eden numbers. So I think that's the answer. June's speaking voice has a bit of a growl and a rasp to it that is almost completely absent in his usual singing voice. And that tonal disparity is what I assume causes people to always kind of forget what he sounds like after hearing him talk. In terms of a vocal comparison, I honestly just chose these two characters because I'm most familiar with the series they come from, but it actually illustrates what I was talking about quite well. So we'll listen first and then I'll come back to it. When Yuma sings for Kaoru, Saidam Kaoru, at least in his solos, he's almost exclusively using that higher tone that's very clean and even, and for Takaomi he's staying lower to the point that you can hear a little more of that rasp coming through. And for anyone that isn't familiar with Dreaming as a franchise, once again, it deserved better. But also, the characters in that game were divided into duos that typically had a lot of stories and duets together, and the character that Takaomi was paired with and has at least 3 duets with is voiced by Natsuki Hanae. So truly Hyojun in a different font, but it's kind of fun that it happened that way. But when we're talking about June, he doesn't really stay in one style of singing or the other. Yes, he tends to sing higher more often, but in certain songs he does dip down and bring out that more growly side of his voice. And you'll see that as we go through the songs. That was a long introduction, but let's get to the music and hopefully that will emphasize my points even more. I realized in that whole intro spiel I never really talked specifically about June's voice, and the major reason for that is that when he's using that higher tone, there's actually very little to talk about in terms of identifying features. The most consistent and noticeable is his vibrato, but otherwise his voice is so neutral that it's hard to describe it any other way. As you can probably imagine, this makes it great for blending, and he can pretty much sing with anyone. And in terms of his technique and the way he actually sounds, he has a very solid, well-supported voice. But it's really hard to describe in the ways that I'd normally talk about what makes one singer different from another. His mid-tone, however, is where things get interesting. He gets a tiny bit of a vocal cry on the one line, which happens occasionally but not super often. But there's this underlying breathiness to especially the ends of his phrases that also comes out in his normal speaking voice for June, and brings more of that raspy element to his vocals. He also only sings with Hiyori here, and as I'd mentioned previously, when he sings with Hiyori, he pretty much always stays up high. I've heard people say that they find it hard to tell who's singing in Eve's songs, and I usually don't have that problem. But looking back, I'm starting to realize that because Hiyori to me has a very distinct cadence and certain vocal inflections that he likes to use, it's far less I can tell June and Hiyori apart from their individual voices, and far more I can tell that's June because it's not Hiyori. And I think after everything I've said so far, you can probably tell what the difference between those statements is. He gets to sing with everyone here, so you get at least a baseline of how his voice works with the other Eden members. But unlike with Hiyori, where he always sings a certain way, he's a bit more flexible when he's singing with Ibara and Nagisa. At least in this song, he's mixed under Ibarra and his voice is mostly just support. And in the future, Nagisa will typically go into harmony with whoever he's singing with. But here I think there's enough of a difference between Nagisa and Jun that Jun's allowed to hit that more breathy part of his tone and still have it sound good because of how deep Nagisa's voice naturally is. He actually sings with Nagisa the least overall, but I do like when they get to sing together because I find they let Jun do more interesting things with him. A lot of Eden's songs are pretty fast and rhythmic, so he really hasn't had time to fully expand on his vibrato yet, but you can already hear hits of it on the ends of his notes. And before I forget, I'm going to structure this video basically the same way I did the Ibarra one, so full Eden first, then Eve, then everything else. This one is actually super interesting because he gets extended duets with everyone, but this is one of the few times he pretty much sits in that mid-tone throughout the entire song, even during the duets with Hiyori, so their voices sound much more distinct than in most of their other duet work. He and Nagisa are mixed almost completely even again, and it's the same with Ibarra here, and there are times they sound much more alike than they usually do, because Jun's allowed to stay in that much richer, more distinct part of his voice. This is also the first time I noticed how much he sounds specifically like Haruki Ishii when he's using that one particular tone. And this might be down to how much Helios music I listen to that it stuck out to me, but I have nobody else to share this with, so... It's really the tonal quality and the push of breath at the end of his lines that does it for me and reminds me a lot of Ren. And this actually isn't entirely off topic because they did announce the next OnStars and Helios collab, which is Rina and Himeru from OnStars with Ren, Gast, and Junior from Helios, and they'll be getting a song again, so that'll be fun. But on that same topic, while Jun isn't part of the lecture unit rap battle and he hasn't had any rapping to this point in the video, if I had to do my hip mic comparison, it would be Jiro, who shares a voice actor with Ren. But again, it's the inflections and the way they both shape the end of their phrases, so there you go. Hopefully that's my one and only tangent for this video, but if I get to talk about Helios music at all, I'm happy. Here we get the first instance of his rapping, and I stand by my Jiro comparison here, but this is kind of a general return to form for Eden songs where he's mostly staying up higher, he's mixed under Ibarra in their duets, and there's a bit of lower singing on some of the verse solo lines, but overall he's kind of playing background support for most of the rest of Eden. His rapping in general is pretty solid in terms of rhythm. In the Ibarra video, I talked about how sometimes he tended to be behind the beat in some of these earlier songs, but Jun's fairly on top of it, and he's actually hitting the beats pretty hard. It's also much closer to his speaking voice, so again, we get a little bit of growliness coming through. Most of his singing in this song is in duets, and again, mostly with Hiyori, where they sound very close to the same, but he gets to have a couple of speak singing parts that pop out of that, and I had to listen to this last part super carefully, so if you've got earbuds, this is going to be the left one, but the word day that he sings with Ibarra is the first time that he really goes up into, this one's more of like a pseudo falsetto because it doesn't really sound like head voice to me, but it's interesting because Ibarra does this kind of slide up while staying in chest voice, so there's actually a pretty significant difference in technique even though they're hitting the same note. But the main reason I'm mentioning it is that because this is the point where he starts singing with Ibarra almost as much as Hiyori, and it's also the point where his voice starts getting mixed more evenly with Ibarra and not just as underlying support. For being pretty early in the rotation, Exceed is actually a fairly decent showcase of Jun's voice for his first feature 5-star song. This line especially has so much personality. And he really gets to play around with his tone and drop more into that mid-range. Even when he's going up higher, it's much more of a belt, and you get to hear his vibrato and just how strong his vocals are, and how easy it is for him to push through those notes. He gets to rap again, which pretty much always means he's going to be using a lower tone, and while he does sing a lot with Ibarra, once again they're mixed pretty evenly, so it never feels like he's taking a back seat in this song. Jun's voice is so versatile that I'm very curious to see what his next feature event song will be like, since they could pretty much do anything and he'd sound good on it. He doesn't get a whole lot of long lines in this song, but once again what I'm coming to realize is that Jun is really the guy they can throw in anywhere, and he's going to sound good and be able to adapt to what's needed from him vocally. The speaking section before the chorus is probably the lowest we've heard him go so far, and he gets a lot of growl to his voice when he gets down there, and then when he's singing with Hiyori, he's back to that really clean, high tone. And since I didn't have a lot to say about this song, I'll bring in a question I had on the teacher's video about whether Jun and Jean's singing have any similarities given their backstory. And I think if anything, the technical side of it is where you'll find those. Both of them are very technically good singers with very clean tones that never really sound like they're straining to hit any of the notes, but still have wide ranges. Their styles, however, are very different. Because Jean's singing is typically pretty lazy, he doesn't enunciate that clearly, and his attack on notes is generally rather soft, while Jun's much more on top of the beat and tends to hit his consonants pretty hard. So I guess that's my answer there. Technically there are some similarities, but stylistically the actual physical way they sing is pretty different. I really do love that last line he gets in the bridge because you can just hear the emotion behind it. It's almost like he's singing through gritted teeth. I talked a lot in the Ibarra video about how much I love this song, and I actually did start working on a song analysis of it that included a 90-second piano medley of other songs with the same chord progression. I won't spoil it just in case I actually ever do make the video, but it was a very popular progression throughout the 2000s into the early 2010s, and if you want a song to hit an emotional note, it's very effective at conveying that. Since Jun's first solo was a ballad, this isn't technically the first time we've heard him in a ballad, but he handles them really well, and it gives him a chance to expand his singing and really get a chance to showcase his vibrato. It also has what's probably the lowest line he ever sings, but it's not getting so low that it's whispery or lacking breath support, and the high note he hits along with Ibarra is super clean, so it's a song that he can really show off his range in. I could still talk about this song for a long time, but maybe that will inspire me to actually get the video done.
期待して寸前ブラックアウトの自分にと罰を言ったり来たりらしなるはらがいない一分を呪うのになれてもダメというの気まぐれで僕ら
There isn't a lot in Keep Out, but it's a song I really like because I find it super interesting to listen to. And June's actually doing a lot vocally, even in the few lines that he has. He gets to play around with his dynamics, and there's a lot of push and pull within the melody. There's a couple of quick shots up into head voice that are incredibly clean and sound effortless, and he pulls back on the volume at the same time and then immediately comes down and gets louder again. And he gets another kind of rhythmic speaking part at the end that lets him go down lower, so for one of the shorter vocal clips in this video, he really makes the most of his time. This is also pretty short compared to some of the other songs, but the biggest difference between this and some of the earlier Eden songs is that it feels like June's finally able to find a consistent place to settle his voice into. This is probably the first time he gets to sing with Hiyori and doesn't try to match his tone. And he's staying low enough to the point that it's very easy to differentiate their voices even in the duet lines, which certainly didn't happen in earlier songs. Even when he's singing with Nagisa, it feels like by now in the timeline the producers kind of automatically gave anyone Nagisa duets with a higher harmony, but they're singing the same pitch and it sounds perfectly fine. So I'm glad that even at this point they're continuing to experiment with June and not just using him to fill in the gaps any longer. And again, not a whole lot here, but it does continue on from the last song in that June's voice is really feeling much more defined in these more recent songs. The one line with Nagisa he gets here starts in unison and then he goes up into the higher harmony, which I have no issues with because June sounds great on those higher notes, but it's still a change from how I think it would have been in the beginning. He also gets a really nice line with Hiyori where they both crescendo on the last sustained note. And June's one of those singers where he can do fairly technical things in unison with other singers, which certainly isn't the case for everyone, but it's so easy for him that sometimes I forget to be impressed when it happens. We've talked earlier about how June tends to sing in the Eve songs, but isolating his vocals like this is still interesting because he does get these little pockets of more individualized singing, but when he's in duets with Hiyori, he always pulls back up into that very neutral tone. There's one line where he sounds especially like Hiyori in the way he ends his phrase, which doesn't happen super often, but I could see why it would be hard to tell who's singing here especially. Eve as a subunit gets to do some interesting things because this obviously has some jazz influences, but their subsequent songs are very poppy, and I think June's voice can handle that just fine. And I haven't talked about the live concerts yet, but I would definitely recommend finding the live version of Trap for You, because if you're wondering where the quote-unquote kiss comes from in the MV, it's from a live performance. The voice actors did it first. And I'd say that overall Yuma tends to stay more in that mid-tone during live, so it does sound different from the recorded versions overall. Sun That Smile is such a fun song. It's got that really summery vibe that always makes me happy when I hear songs like it. And because it's almost pure pop and has no real edge, June's basically staying up in his higher tone the entire time. It does make sense for the song in this case and adds to the very bright feeling of it. But since he's using it for longer periods of time, it does let you hear once again how smooth his transitions into head voice are when he's up there. Because his chest and head voices are very similar when he's presumably singing with a raised larynx, there's still a lot of vibrato and a little bit of that breathiness coming through on certain lines, but overall this is probably the most consistent showcase of that higher tone. He does stay lower in the verses here, which makes sense since while there's still a lot of pop elements to this song, it's definitely got a more sultry vibe and there's some whispering happening in certain sections that adds to that. I think my favorite thing Jude does here, apart from once again getting to go into that super clean high tone, is adding some ornamentation to certain lines. I always like when vocalists get to show off a little by doing these little vocal runs, and again, it sounds super natural and effortless when June does it. This might be the true testament to how neutral June's voice can get, because this is one of the only times that Sora is ever mixed evenly with another character, and it sounds good. I talked about this briefly in the Natsume video, but usually producers tend to really undermix Sora, because the character voice he uses is just really hard to blend with. But it works with June, so it's pretty cool to hear that. I also really appreciate that June's line with Tsumugi keeps the same harmony as the one that Nagisa and Sora sing earlier. Since normally with Eden songs, any line Nagisa has that uses harmony is generally sung in unison if it's done again with any other combination of characters. But getting to hear June and Tsumugi sing that harmony is really nice. And of course, the biggest thing with this song is that June gets a feature at the end where he's doing his own thing while everyone else is singing the chorus. If you've watched the Mao video, you'll probably recall that Mao gets these kind of moments pretty often, so I tend to associate it with him. But I love it when any character gets it, and June sounds great here. As usual with these cover songs, he doesn't get to sing much, but he does get to sing with both Makoto and Mao. And honestly, even though the Mao line is short, I think their voices work really well because of how warm Mao's tone is. The Makoto line, they're both singing pretty low, but the big solo line June gets, he goes really high again, and then does the exact same melodic line with Hiyori, so it's great that we get to hear it twice. So the wiki says that the first line is just June and Adonis, but like, Tedder is another one of those voices I can pick out, and he's definitely there, so I'm inclined to believe it's a trio line just like the one that comes later. And in this case, June's voice works super well as a bridge between the other two, so it ends up sounding good and still allowing you to hear all the individual singers. He does get to sing with everyone in this song, and with the blend of voices, it doesn't make sense for him to be using that higher tone, so he's staying pretty much in the middle. But again, during his duets with Madara and Kuro, everyone he's singing with is different enough from his voice that it's easy to hear all of them. I know some people had complained about June being in this song because it seemed obvious, but despite kind of the reputation and the character traits that slotted him in with this group, he doesn't really get songs like this, so I don't really have an issue with it overall. He gets to stay super raspy here, and I think it's mostly because in that middle tone he does share some similarities with Toya's voice, so it's naturally going to sound good with Akito, and they do sound really good together. I'd actually mentioned in the Mayoi video how typically Akito's voice is very overbearing, but he's actually pulling back while he's singing with June here, and their voices complement each other well. The unison jumps into falsetto are also really clean on both their parts, and then we get the one line of June actually talking, which I think is pretty much the only time that happens during any of his songs, so you can really hear how deep his normal speaking voice is compared to a lot of the singing he does. This, admittedly, is another song where June stays up high, but this time is to create a contrast rather than to match with Hiyori. Because Izumi's voice is so deep and so aspirate, and because Hiro has this underlying breathiness that's always kind of in the background of his vocals, if June was singing any lower, I think it would be too breathy with all of them singing together. So by using that super clean, clear part of his tone, he's actually providing the necessary balance to keep them all sounding good together. Apart from that, his vocals in this song are beautiful. He gets to take the lower harmony with Hiro and the higher with Izumi, so you can hear him doing both parts. And his voice just has so much control and restraint while still allowing those moments of emotion to come through. Just like with Deep Eclipse, he can really let his vibrato loose, and like this, really impressive. Those high notes are just so clean, there's no breath behind them at all, and he's doing a little bit more with vocal cries than normal, but it suits the song. I'm glad he got to be part of this group because it's such a good showcase for him, and when he's using that particular tone, it's really perfect for ballads. And speaking of ballads, from what I can recall, the general reaction when the preview for this song dropped wasn't really that everyone was upset about June getting a ballad, but most people weren't expecting it. To be fair, Eden in general hadn't had a lot of content yet, but even so, it was a big departure from the rest of their discography. But as we've already established, June sounds great in ballads. Since he's not trying to match anyone else vocally, even though he's using that higher tone, it's a bit breathier than normal, and that gives it a more quiet, contemplative effect that really suits the song. He does get to play around with dynamics a bit more too, and this crescendo into the final chorus is really nice because it's not overbearing, but you can still hear a very obvious volume increase that moves with the music. June's solos in terms of story progression are great because this one is very much full of longing, and there's still a sense of hopefulness that things will turn out the way he wants them to. And then by the time you get to Unlock the Soul, it's transitioned from just being a wish to more of a, I'm going to make the things I want happen, and the music really reflects that as well.
I will make you be
I'm kind of in two minds about this song though, because while part of me wishes the key was a little lower so Jun could hit some of the lines a little harder without losing the edge to his voice, those belts are very impressive and wouldn't have nearly the same effect if the overall notes were lower. But the contrast between these solos does illustrate once again how versatile Jun's voice is, because he can handle the long sustained phrases in ballads just as well as he can get through the very fast, tight lyrics in this song, and can adapt his style to fit each one and have it sound completely natural. Although, just like with his next feature song, I'm not sure what I want his third solo to be, since at this point Jun really has covered so many genres and it'll be very interesting to see what direction they go with that song. And that brings us to the end. Once again, I'm so sorry for how long this video took, but I hope it was enjoyable, and it was really fun to take a closer look at Jun's voice because I've always thought he was a really good vocalist, but now I think I understand the why better, and I hope that came across in this video. Next up, my plans haven't really changed, so I'm doing Tomoya, and then we'll probably tackle Kohaku, so that's the schedule as of right now. As always, thank you so much for watching, and please like, comment, do all the things the algorithm wants you to do, and I will see you next time.